finding us. It looks as though most of you have found us. Sorry for the mistake in the brochure, but glad that you're here. To many of you in the room today, Goodwin Cooke needs no introduction. On the other hand, I can say that I am always introducing a new Goodwin Cooke. Goody's knowledge of and comfort level in so many nations, cultures, and policies in the world makes it hard to believe he's just one person. I'm not suggesting that he is schizophrenic or imperial. He's just a virtuoso. We welcome him back as an honorary member of the Schemel family and a welcome voice of wisdom and perspective on China today. China, as you will see, is yet another of his intellectual conquests. The title of his talk is China Today, What We Need to Know. It's an important topic as the rising influence of China on the world scene and its off-the-charts size and potential make it an essential topic for our discussion. China's relationship with the U.S. is bound to be of increasing complexity and importance in the years ahead. Goody poses the question, will the relationship be one of rivalry, cooperation, or simply coexistence? So let's hear what he has to say. Please join me in welcoming Goodwin Cooke.
Thank you, Sandra, and you may regret all those words about virtuoso and stuff like that. To the contrary, I'm not a China hand, as they used to call the State Department people who served there way back, nor am I a China expert. I'm not a China scholar. In fact, I'm not a scholar at all. A scholar knows a whole lot about something. At Syracuse, where I taught for 20-something years, I was more a utility infielder than a specialist, so that I cover things lightly but not deeply. I can talk lightly about China, but in no great profundity, and I would appreciate as many questions as you can offer. I have read a great deal about China, and I've been to China. Has anybody else been to China? Everybody's been to China. Okay, well then you probably know as much as I, except that you've had the same experience that I had. I am sure you found it huge, you found it fascinating, and you found it bewildering. And anybody who says he came back from China now has his mind around it, to use Sandra's wording, is telling you a falsehood. It ain't so. Can't be done. It's enormous. 1.3 billion people. 1 person in every 5 in the world is Chinese. In fact, 2 people in every 7, I think, are Chinese or Indian. 37%. 1 person to 3+ are Chinese or Indian. That's an enormous number of folk. It extends from the Pacific way into Central Asia. There's a border with Afghanistan. It extends from the rainforest in Vietnam up to Siberia, and the great steppes and the cold. Chinese, it's a big country. They have thought big since their origins. They do big things, the big wall, the enormous canals built way back by the first dynasty in the 1st century before the Common Era. The greatest dam in the world just finished, the Three Gorges Dam, which if you've seen it, everyone's worried it's going to be an ecological nightmare, but it's very darn impressive. These folk think big. The economy is the world's 2nd largest, having passed Japan. The last time I spoke in China was in Syracuse, and somebody said, "Oh, are they going to catch us?" Probably not in gross domestic product for some years, but they are going to. Most likely another 20, 30 years, I would say 20, China will have the same gross domestic product as the United States. I don't think we need worry about that. The thing that counts is what is called per capita gross domestic product, and in that China logs way behind. We are number 8 in the world, and the ones ahead of us are places like Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, tiny little places with rich folks in them. So in that field, we're way up. China is probably about number 100 and something. So China has many decades to go before it catches up with us in general standard of living, if it ever does. We don't know what's going to happen. It's old. The Han civilization began about the time of Sumer in Mesopotamia. But there's been a continuous Han civilization now for 6 or 7 millennia. Mostly the same language, a writing form, indeed the same political culture. The first dynasty to bring China in as one country began in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Only lasted 2 centuries, but 2 centuries is quite a while. It started on the great canals in the east. It started on the wall, and it built those terracotta warriors we all saw during our visit west of Xi'an when we went out there and looked at these extraordinary accomplishments. This was in the time of Rome. It was in the time of the Roman Republic that all this was done. Rome has since faded. China is still there, very much there. The political culture of China has remarkable continuity. The emperors dedicated the political culture to harmony, prosperity, and longevity. It means longevity of the emperor, but essentially it means the longevity of the political system. And the political system, more or less, has lasted. It has lasted even through invasions of China. The Mongols, the Manchus, adopted this as a political system, became Chinese emperors. Incidentally, harmony, prosperity, and longevity are not radical. They are reflected in the preamble to our own Constitution, which is done to create domestic tranquility, which can be called harmony, prosperity, and security, which could be longevity of the political system. Our Constitution, however, has another clause, which is to ensure the blessings of liberty to us and our progeny, which is not part of the cultural system in China. The blessings of liberty are not something that Chinese are much aware of. They are becoming aware of it. They're becoming aware of it because of exposure to the rest of the world, because Chinese students are coming here and learning about it and taking it back to China, but it is not part of the fundamental elements of Chinese political society or political thought. The invaders took up this political philosophy, and so did Chairman Mao. And Chairman Mao took over in 1949. We were there last year in 2009, which was 60 years after Chairman Mao established the People's Republic. And Barbara got lost in Tiananmen Square. It was a really marvelous show. There were about 500,000 people, according to the newspapers, and maybe more than that, in Tiananmen Square that day to celebrate. The people walking around having ice cream cones and looking at the floats. And Barbara headed over this way and couldn't find our group, so then she started wandering around looking for us. And we had to form a posse and look for her. And we saw a lot of Chinese people in the square. She made it, we found her. So Mao united China. And many Chinese we spoke to said Mao did a lot of good for China. The sense of unity in China that he instilled was very important for China. At the same time, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution destroyed or greatly weakened the Chinese economy. And it took Deng Xiaoping, his successor, to restore the economy by doing a remarkable experiment, which hasn't been tried to my knowledge elsewhere, which is to keep an authoritarian communist government and establish a capitalist economic system in which people are going to invest money, get rich, make profits, do all the things that communism denies, but still pay allegiance to a government that's called communist and can be quite authoritarian. So this is an experiment. We don't know how it's going to work. So far, it's worked economically very well indeed. China has been growing at the rate of 8 to 10% a year for 10 or 15 years or more. There were some slowdowns in the 1980s, but it appears that China has survived the economic recession in which we find ourselves now and is going to return to 8 to 10% growth. The point is that this is growth on so low a level in comparison to the United States that it's going to take a long time to reach our level, depending on what happens to us, because we're growing too, but not quite as fast. There are 3 areas of the Chinese situation which I'd like to address, and others you may want to talk about and maybe even help me, because you may, as I say, know as much as I. The first one is economy and trade, which is of enormous importance to us. The second is regional tensions and confrontations, which have intensified in the last year, year and a half, and have become very, very worrisome indeed. And finally, human rights. So let me start with the economy and trade. And let me start with a view from Beijing. How do they feel? How do they look out? What do they see about China? We see a large monolithic economy, 1,300,000,000 people, 4 times our size, 4 times more people than we have, all united, driving towards progress, economic growth, etc., and so forth, building huge things, the dam and other great investments going on now. They see that they're a very poor country. They see that about this 1,300,000,000 people, maybe 200 million of them live in what you would call a first world economy. At least 800 or 900 million of them live in what we'd call a fourth world economy. As poor as people in very poor countries indeed, Bangladesh. Most of China is very, very poor. If you get out west, you have people in rice paddies barely on the monetary economy, they basically barter. So they have millions and millions and millions of poor people. But their education system, which Mao promoted and which has been quite successful, has led to most of these people being literate. And most of them have access, not their own television set, but someplace in the village where they live, there'll be a television set, a radio. So they are aware of the wealth in the rest of China. And they are anxious to participate. So they're migrating, they're going to the cities, and the cities aren't ready for them. They're trying to get the cities ready for them, but the cities are growing, exploding. Shanghai, as people there will know, has these incredible skyscrapers in the middle, but on the outskirts, apartments are mushrooming. Great big 10-story apartment buildings mushrooming every place. Cities are growing from little towns of 400,000 to 4 million. There's a city right next to the dam that was a town, as I say, of 400,000. And in 4 years, it grew to 4 million people. And they had to go and build housing for them. And some of it was luxury housing. There are beautiful row houses along the river where it looks like Georgetown or something, where people live, and then in the background there are these great apartment houses, and they have to find jobs for them, they have to find health care for them, they have to do sewage and all the amenities for them. They think big, but this is a colossal problem. And this huge number of poor people are now demanding participation. They want to have some of the good things of life that maybe they've heard about in Beijing and Shanghai. Why can't we live that way? Why don't we have Mercedes cars? Why can't we eat at Maxim's or shop at whatever you shop at? I can't think of an American store that's not bust. Why can't we do that? They're also aware that many of their governments are corrupt, and indeed they are, particularly in the north part of the country, and they're protesting. And it's perfectly legitimate to protest, and it's perfectly legitimate to go on strike. But that's not harmony. How hard can the government crack down? It doesn't want to crack down, but they have to have harmony. So how are they going to deal with this? And sitting in Beijing, you're worried about that. The way to deal with this is to insist that maintain at least this 10% growth every year. That much more wealth is created so that these people will get gradually a better share of, or a bigger share of what's going on, get a larger proportion for themselves, and that the whole overall pie is increased as their segment is increased. How can you guarantee continued growth? Well, what they've done is what Deng Xiaoping, Mao's successor, started, is to build an export-based economy. This is why China, probably why, after Tiananmen Square, China recognized that it was in very bad odor in the rest of the world and began behaving much more moderately, talking more moderately, lowering its voice, lowering its image. It wanted to get into the World Trade Organization, which was happening, being discussed at that time. The World Trade Organization was created in 1994, and you had free trade for between the signatory powers, or much freer trade, and China wanted in on that. The United States granted China GATT privileges, General Agreement on Tariff and Trade Privileges, in the 1990s, and China was able to join the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization had been amended from the GATT rules to include textiles. So now textiles are traded freely. And China went into the textile business, as you all know, in an enormous way. If you look at your costume and look around, you'll find about half of what you're wearing is made in China. Some of it's from Indonesia or Jordan or someplace else, some Latin America, but China is dominating the world textile industry. Go to Walmart's. Walmart's in China is sort of a partnership, so that China is growing on the basis of exports. That produces dollars. And China holds a whole lot of dollars because they haven't bought as much from us as we have bought from them. But what's it going to do with the dollars? Can't spend them in China. Doesn't want to import. So they sit there. That is not necessarily making the workers rich. Having a huge bank account in dollars in Beijing is not helping the person working in a small factory someplace. He wants more. He's worried about the corrupt government. He wants a better house. He wants a car, at least a motorcycle. He wants more. China has a tradition of saving. Chinese workers, particularly poor workers, save for their old age. The United States, we don't do that. We have Social Security, God bless us. They don't. So China has a tradition of sort of taking care of its old people, but China has a one-child policy. So China is getting older and older, and these couples only have one child to take care of them, and they are going to save. The economists will say, look, China, you've got to start spending. If your workers will buy things, then it will make more things for more work, demand for more workers to make things. You can live a lot on domestic growth. You don't have to export your way into prosperity. You can make things and sell them in your own economy to build your economic growth. And that's pretty much what we did. But that's very tough to do because the cultural tradition in China is saving. The Chinese are aghast at the idea of credit cards. I mean, we don't have credit cards. Personally, not maxing out your credit card. Unheard of. Borrowing money in China is a very scary thing for a Chinese who's poor because he doesn't want to be in debt. So this is going to require a whole new way of looking at their economy. China has kept its currency cheap. It's actually pegged to the dollar, and the dollar has dropped very considerably in value in the world. So the renminbi is set with the dollar, and when the dollar drops in value, the renminbi drops in value. That means that if our exports to China are inexpensive, then Chinese exports to us are inexpensive. Actually, in real terms, if the renminbi was permitted to float, which the GATT, which the WTO requires, if the renminbi floated, it would probably be 20, 25, maybe 30% higher than it is. In which case, Chinese goods would be more expensive, we wouldn't buy them. Our goods would be cheaper, China would buy more of them, and then the trade balance would be rectified, at least to some extent. This is what Paul Krugman is arguing about in the New York Times. Charged Paul Krugman, roughly every 2 weeks, has an article punishing China for not letting its currency float and thus tying up the world trade system. There's some doubt whether that really would work. We don't know. It probably has to do something. But Chinese leaders, although they can think big when they make their minds up, are very nervous about this. If that 10% growth figure should take a deep decline and there should be some kind of a real recession in China, and the workers hoping to get a better life suddenly see their future slightly diminished or dimmed, it's going to be very difficult politically for the Chinese to maintain harmony. If prosperity is diminished, harmony may be tough to find. So the Chinese leadership is looking at this with great care. In the meantime, we continue to encourage them to rely on domestic production for their prosperity rather than export production. And China, actually, did anybody hear or see the Prime Minister, his name is Hu Xiaobang, I think I have it written down, Wen Xiaobai. He had a long talk with Fareed Zakaria. Did anyone hear that? A fascinating discussion in which he said, we are worried about this. We're not sure it's going to work. If our prices go up, you will buy from Vietnam, whose prices may not go up, or from Bangladesh. So that we don't think that this is going to do you that much good, and it may not do us that much good. We are looking at this very, very carefully. The economists I've talked to suggested that China will move its currency up, allow it to float slightly. It'll go up some. Whether it'll go up enough to make a real difference in the trade balance is not clear. So this is going to remain difficult for us and difficult for them. Pollution. All of you remember getting off the airport, wherever you landed, and taking one whiff of the air around a Chinese city, and it smells just awful. They're still using a great deal of coal, some of it's soft coal. They're using a great deal of petroleum. They haven't done much on reduction of pollution. Air pollution is awful. They're worried about it. Sometimes it gets so bad that people wear face masks. In Beijing for the Olympic Games, to save the athletes, they closed down all the cars, sent them all out of town, stopped driving. And it still smelled in Beijing, but the athletes were able to run. At the same time, it is getting worse. China is spending billions and billions on alternative energy sources. Tom Friedman of the New York Times writes perhaps weekly or twice a month about following China, and China is spending billions and billions of dollars to try to find new sources of energy, wind power, solar power, whatever you can do, new technologies. We are not, and he condemns the United States for this and thinks we should be following the Chinese example. Perhaps we should, I doubt we will. But it's extremely, extremely worrisome for them. Energy, where are they going to get it? They can't go on with coal unless they find much cleaner ways to burn soft coal. It means they're going to have to rely on petroleum for the time being. So they have to get petroleum where they can. China has been making enormous efforts abroad to secure sources of petroleum. I don't even know, about 4 years ago, China had a big party and invited all the chiefs of state of Africa. Something like 50 people were invited to China to have a huge banquet and discuss relations, which meant we would like a lien on your raw materials. So China has been buying up prospects for petroleum in African countries, in West Africa, and some awful dictatorships. In Sudan, China has contracts for exploiting a great deal of the petroleum in Sudan, which is spread along a line between northern Sudan and southern Sudan, most of it in southern Sudan. Incidentally, southern Sudan is almost certain going to vote for secession from Sudan next January when the elections come. How China's going to cope with that one, I don't know, and how Mr. Bashir in Khartoum is going to cope with that one, I don't know. But China's worried because it's looking, is that petroleum source going to dry up? Where else can we go? This accounts for China going south into the South China Sea, and I'll talk about this again in a minute, and claiming, well, the translation was funny, absolute sovereignty over the South China Sea. That was one translation. The translation now has come out that the South China Sea is part of our core interests, which is the way they talk about Tibet and Taiwan. So China is staking a major claim in the South China Sea, which has some islands in it, the Spratly Islands, I think they're called, and some rocks that stick up, but probably has petroleum. And China wants to exploit the petroleum, and it doesn't want anybody else exploiting the petroleum. So it's making quite aggressive noises, which I'll talk about in a minute, about the South China Sea. And the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, ASEAN, Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia and so forth, are very worried about China's behavior in the South China Sea, which is probably to do with petroleum. They're worried about global warming. The northern part of China is dry now. Most of the rivers have dried up. The wheat crop is way down. They rely on the wheat crop for a lot of the things they eat. Where are they going to get the water from? Well, they're going to build a viaduct, apparently. They're going to build a viaduct from the rainforest down in South China, I think it's about 2,000 miles long, to irrigate the wheat fields in northern China. I mean, China thinks big. And that is a project almost unimaginable. You can't imagine Rome considering that. I mean, it's just an appalling thing to do. And they are thinking about it. I don't know whether they're going to make it. The trade imbalance in constant terms is a worry to us, but there are other things too. Communications technology. The Chinese tend to ignore copyright. They have firms that copy American movies, American software. So when Bill Gates comes out with something new, or Steve Jobs comes up with a new whatever widget, it is copied and on sale for 1/10 of the price in Beijing almost before it hits Scranton. The new software coming out by Bill Gates, that is literally true. Somebody buys it right from the factory, puts it on a computer, sends it to Beijing, somebody puts it on a disk, and it's all over China for $10 a copy, and we're asked to pay $250. We are trying to cure that. The Chinese say, well, it's very tough. We're trying to regulate. These are independent firms doing this. We have to regulate them, but you know, we can't. We are worried about export subsidizing. The Chinese actually subsidize their textiles. China has built entire cities, and a Chinese city is not just a 30,000. This would be 150, 200,000 people doing nothing but make neckties. And they build the city, they get the machinery, they get everything going, and then they send the neckties far more cheaply than we can make them here or almost any place else. So they dominate the necktie market. That is presumably against the rules, subsidizing your exports against the World Trade Organization rules. China is violating them, and we're trying to get after them. We accuse them of dumping. They're selling things more cheaply than they cost to manufacture. That is dumping, and that's against the rules. These are worrisome. Actually, there's some good news in this picture. China is becoming accustomed to living with the World Trade Organization. Instead of simply stonewalling, say, no, it's a lie, we're not doing it, you're making it up, go away, they are negotiating at the World Trade Organization and using its arbitration system to resolve disputes. And that's good news. If China can become accustomed the way the rest of us have to negotiating in international forums, then abiding by the decisions made in those international forums, everybody cheats, we cheat. French cheat all the time, Italians are worse. But accustomed to that form of dealing in trade negotiations, instead of simply no or putting on sanctions against various goods, it can be much more successful and peaceful. And it appears that China may be getting used to this. There's a lot of competition going on. High-speed rail. The Chinese are way ahead of us in high-speed rail technology. They want to build a train that goes from Beijing to Shanghai, and I don't know, but much more quickly you can get to the Beijing airport, fly down, go in again. And other high-speed rail, we are still working on it. In New York, we're having a big time as whether a train that goes from Syracuse to Albany at 80 miles an hour instead of 40 miles an hour would be an improvement. It's an improvement, but not enough, and everybody drives. But we are going to compete on that, and they are ahead of us. They're competing on aircraft. They may be the next generation of narrow-bodied passenger aircraft and compete with Boeing. Boeing's worried about it. But that's okay, I think. The Congress will be worried, but that's healthy competition. Competition within given rules is legitimate and healthy. That's good for us, good for China. So I don't think we are going to have a trade war with China. I don't think we're going to go get into combative deregulation. You lower your currency, we lower our currency, make our goods cheaper and cheaper and cheaper until the money's not worth anything. I think we're going to be able to keep away from that. I think China is aware of the problem, And these are not stupid people, they're not rash people. It appears that they will be able to raise their currency sufficiently to keep things okay without getting into a trade war. Regionalism. China is obviously feeling its oats. I mean, I thought the opening to the Olympic Games was simply swell on the television. It was a very, very exciting occasion. So did the Chinese. And they worked hard on it. And it was very exciting. And I think, gosh, we are the #2 in the world. We are somebody of importance. Actually, Deng Xiaoping, Mao's first successor, and others in the 1990s, and the Bush administration, second Bush administration, played soft abroad. In the 90s and first decade of this millennium, they were careful about this. They didn't want to get into disputes. They wanted to have the Olympic Games. They wanted to get into the World Trade Organization. Both they've done. So they were cool about this. Now they're getting just a little bit more aggressive. And this tends to worry their neighbors, and it worries us. As I say, China is getting very aggressive in its language in the South China Sea, making all sorts of noises about the Spratly Islands being the sacred soil of China and all these rocks being part of China. I thought Hillary Clinton delivered a very good rebuttal to that. China made this announcement during a conference at ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and Hillary Clinton said, she didn't say you're wrong, it isn't you don't have absolute sovereignty, that's not true. She said we were very anxious to continue the policy of open seas on the high seas, trade routes must be continued, and we look forward to discussing this with our Chinese friends and colleagues. Even that was considered very aggressive on Hillary's part. So there was quite a reaction from China. No, this is our core interest. We want to stick with it. Henry Kissinger used to say that the Chinese have a remarkable way of appearing to be in an absolute fury. Huge demonstrations, as though it was entirely spontaneous, when basically it's been very carefully planned. So the Chinese rages can be taken with just a bit of salt. They do that to show that they are angry and upset, but they may not be as angry and upset as they pretend to be. The Yellow Sea in the north, they made quite a fuss about that. When the North Koreans torpedoed a South Korean warship, the response was quite strong from the United States and South Korea. China played it soft the way it usually does with North Korea. But we scheduled joint exercises, naval exercises with South Korea to show the flag, to show strength against North Korea. This is a pretty standard, and I don't think particularly useful, instrument used in international relations. If you're mad at somebody, real mad, you hold military exercises. If it's a land power, you have a war game on their borders, and if you're sea power, you do something else on their borders. So we sent over a carrier task force, and with a couple of South Korean destroyers, we had a war game. The Chinese were furious. You're sending an aircraft carrier to borders of China? My God, you are impinging on our sovereignty. Got very upset. So we said, okay, we'll send the carrier, but we'll keep them a certain distance offshore, so it won't seem so badly to impinge, and that seemed to get us over it. But in other words, they're behaving tough. They're not behaving tough with Taiwan for the time being, because Taiwan is laying low. I mean, Taiwan is enormously sensitive for China. And when the Obama administration approved an arms sales to Taiwan last year, the reaction from Beijing was very vociferous indeed. But since that time, the government of Taiwan has lowered its voice, lowered its stridency, hasn't talked about declaring independence and Taiwanese sovereignty and all this stuff. So the Chinese are leaving Taiwan aside for the time being. But it's always there. And any trouble with Taiwan, can be sure you'll get a great demonstration in Beijing and harsh words from the leadership. They are getting a little tougher with Southeast Asia. They're building dams on the Mekong River, which can stop the flow of water, of course, into Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia. limiting fishing, limiting irrigation, and other things about which Southeast Asia is going to be very sensitive, and simply stonewalling. What are you talking about? No, when there are protests. This is kind of tough. The final one is India. China had a war of some sorts in the 1960s with India over a totally useless, absolutely barren piece of 15,000-foot plateau over in southwestern Tibet. Nobody lives there. It's too tough even for the Tibetans. But it's disputed between India and China. So the Chinese sent a force up there in India, and they exchanged artillery for a couple of months. Nobody much got hurt. But the Chinese are now saying it's ours again, and maybe sending people up there and irritating us. So this is quite unnecessary on China's part. They've increased their defense budget, and it's worrisome. One reason for this that's been suggested is that the premier, I'm terrible on Chinese names, so I have a list someplace. The premier, Hu Jintao, was the first premier to have had no relationship with the army. Deng Xiaoping was in the revolution with Mao. Others have come from the army. Hu Jintao as a civilian. His successor, Xi Jinping, who will be named in 2011, or 2012, has no relationship to the army. So one writer suggested that the Chinese leadership is getting tough abroad to demonstrate to the army that you can rely on us to be tough. It's perfectly understandable. I don't know if it's so, but it's an explanation which suggests that perhaps that will become smoother in the next year or two. Human rights. There are many minorities in China. The Han are a majority, but there's hundreds of minorities. Two of the most important are Tibetan and Uyghurs. Uyghurs out in the western province, where there are a lot of other minorities. There are Turkmen and Kazakhs and Afghans and all sorts of odds and sods of people. The Uyghurs are acting up. Xinjiang, which is the farthest western province, is the largest province in China. It's larger even than Tibet. And China's worried about it. They have been cracking down. I'm not sure it's necessary to crack down. I'm not sure that that's necessary, but the people there are demanding a larger share of the pie. So the solution may be economic. If funds can be transferred to the communities of Uyghurs and Turkmen and so forth, so that they're wealthier, they may not be so anxious for autonomy. I think they're allowed to speak their own language and so forth. Han Chinese are moving into the area and often being given preferential jobs. The Chinese don't want another great massacre. Tiananmen Square set them back a long ways in the rest of the world, so they're anxious not to, but they're behaving quite strictly. The other area is, of course, Tibet. There's only about 3 or 4 million Tibetans spread over this. How am I doing on time? I'm okay. I'll be through with by 1, then we'll. The Chinese are really fed up with Tibet right now. They went in there in the 1950s. The Dalai Lama fled about 1959. And China feels it has done a great deal for Tibet. The population of Tibet was almost totally illiterate except for the monks in their monasteries, or lamaseries. Everybody else couldn't read. They were yak herders and tea farmers or barley farmers or whatever they eat up there, living in what we would consider utter misery, while the monks prayed in the monasteries and ate well and were protected by the aristocratic families in Lhasa and a couple of other cities who formed the army. So the Chinese went up and they built roads and they established commerce and trade and they provided education, they provided medical care, they provided electricity, they provided plumbing, they provided housing for people who wanted to go to the city. In other words, the economic lot of the average Tibetan yak herder is very considerably better than it was. And the Chinese feel that the Dalai Lama chose the Olympic Games as an opportunity to embarrass them. And the world played into his hands and started harassing people carrying the torch to Beijing and stuff like that. that this is not a real nationalist rebellion and it's an uprising, it's a monkish, it's a religious group uprising, a very small minority who were used to governing. And that what the monks want is to go back to the religious ruling, the theocracy, from the Lamaseries that prevailed before the Chinese went there. And that this would be less desirable to most yak herders than the Chinese have been. And so that this is a fake. I don't know. I've never been there. I haven't talked to anybody who can give me a clear view on this. We might be able to lower our sights on this, but it's worrisome. We think that China should be able to join the growing number of countries in the world who recognize that human rights are important. Not just economic rights, but rights of free speech and religion and so forth. We really believe that. And the interesting thing is that Liu Xiaobao, who just received the Nobel Prize, has been imprisoned for talking just about that. And the Chinese are reacting very strongly. This is an attack on the Chinese system. This is an attack on our harmony and our prosperity and our longevity and so forth. I think that's unnecessary. I think that the Chinese probably realize that it's unnecessary. They're going to have to move. In that extraordinary interview, which, get my names right, the Prime Minister, Wen Xiaobao, gave with Fareed Zakaria. Fareed asked him about this, and he said, yes, indeed. We are going to have to become a more open society. I think it is time. It will be difficult for us, but I think it will help us economically and help us with our relations in the rest of the world, and we're going to try for it. Zakaria did not show his astonishment. He's very good at it. The Chinese government renounced this and said this does not represent China's views. But obviously people are thinking about this. I think that would take China a long ways if they would rethink, if they can back away, find a graceful way to back away from the imprisonment of Liu Xiaobao and say, we're not going to cheer for the Nobel Prize, but we think you've served your time. Now go ahead and please try to sin no more. If you do sin, sin quietly. That might work out. Where do we go with this? Will we be friends and cooperating with China? Well, probably not. Great powers don't do that. Great powers all will find themselves in some kind of rivalry, but it need not be antagonistic rivalry. We are profiting from one another already in this huge trade relationship, which can surely grow. If China relies more on domestic growth than trade-promoted growth, China will grow perhaps faster than it is now. It has a lot of cultural implications, but it's conceivable, in which case the relationship can be mutually profitable. And if both sides realize that, and both sides try to abide by the rules as best they can, this can be a very profitable relationship for us and for the rest of the world. If we can't do that, we may find ourselves in a rivalry. I don't think we're going to go to war. In fact, I'm pretty darn sure we won't go to war. But we might get back to rocket rattling, waving rockets over Taiwan and stuff like that, which is really unnecessary in the 21st century. We might be able to escape that. So we may find a way to compete under the rules, and it might be a very successful relationship as far as we can see, which is, well, I can see about 15 years at the very outside. But as far as we can see, that might be a very healthy way to conduct the relationship. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to have questions. Yeah, I'm deaf as a post, and my hearing aid isn't working, so I'm hoping now go back and answer.
China and Iran.
Yeah, China and Iran. China wants resources. China wants resources. China is aware that Iran poses a threat, doesn't pose a threat to China. And China wants to have access to Iranian petroleum. So China is going to go very softly on Iran. very unlikely to vote to impose savage sanctions in the Security Council. That's the way it is. On the other hand, I have my own feelings about Iran, so I shouldn't bring my own politics into this. I think Iran can be dealt with. And I think China could go and talk to Iran and say, you must stop worrying the West this way and stop blathering so. I think that the relationship can be brought under some kind of control. But China almost certainly will not. And we're not going to be able to bully China into blasting Iran. Actually, China and Russia and most of the oil-producing countries are members of something called the Shanghai Cooperative. You know about that? So the Shanghai Cooperative is basically based on petroleum distribution. It includes all the stands, which have a lot of petroleum, and I think Iran has an observer delegation, so they participate. We've asked for observer status, and they've said no. The main partners have said no. But oil producers in East Asia, and Iran is pretty close. I think Iran is an observer. So there are petroleum discussions in the Shanghai Cooperative. And so that means that Shanghai will probably, China will continue to work with Iran to get its petroleum. But maybe lean on them, maybe talk to them. Maybe say, this is unfortunate. But I don't think they're going to vote for heavy sanctions. But since I don't think we should vote for heavy sanctions either, I can't get upset about it. Yeah?
I don't understand this economic situation. The United States, our economy is in such a deficit, the biggest deficit we've ever been in. And I've heard comments or read them that Japan is in some way supporting us or helping, you know, we went into the deficit and they're doing their percentage on it or something. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know about Japan's.
I don't mean Japan, I mean China.
Well, China has come through this crisis very well. It's got a state-managed economy, mostly, and can give orders. So that China has come through this quite well. We're worse off than we are. We're by no means as poor as China. I mean, we're a long ways ahead of China in gross domestic product, and in per capita, we're streets ahead of China. So it's not that much of a worry. I don't think China wants to grind our face in it, because China would like to see a prosperous United States. If we're more prosperous, we'll buy more Chinese neckties. So that I really don't think China wants to do us harm in the trade field. At the same time, the mercantile instinct, the desire to enrich my country at your country's expense, which is a bad idea, is heretical. We are hardwired to be mercantilists. It goes against the grain not to, but I think we may have enough sense not to get in a trade war with China on those grounds. Yeah?
Would you address the fact that China owns so much of the American debt, treasuries, etc.?
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. I am not an economist. I talk to economists, but as they know, if you lay them all end to end, they can't reach a conclusion. So I talk to economists at Syracuse and say, what do you think? And say, well, I think this, but he thinks that, and he thinks the other. Yeah, they own an awful lot of American dollars. We have a huge debt to China, on which we have to pay interest. It's not a huge interest, but it's interest. What good is that to China? What do they do with it? They can buy some stuff in the United States, but okay, that means they won't be producing the goods. They buy all the goods from us, then they're not producing. Their people aren't working. So building up a huge pile of dollars is not doing any good for China's problem of the 800 million people or 700 million people who live in fourth world conditions. I mean, they don't go into the treasury and get dollars. So China owns this debt. They can use it to buy American buildings or American this or American that, which they haven't. The Japanese got horribly burned doing that. They bought Sony, I think, and it went bust. They bought the Rockefeller Center, and that went bust. So I don't think they want to buy into huge American buildings. They may want to invest in the United States. Okay, if you want to start a car company in the United States, fine, that's great. And you get some of the profit and we get some too. That's what the Japanese have done. So Toyotas are made mostly in the United States and it works fine. But really, if I owe you $100, I've got a problem. If I owe you $1 trillion, you've got a problem. So I think China is coming to realize that the huge holdings in American dollars isn't doing them that much good. They can release it. They can say, okay, we're going to sell dollars very cheaply on the world market. And they would be bought up. That would cause inflation in the United States. But it wouldn't necessarily help China, because if they sell these dollars, the value of the dollar goes down still further, so their holdings diminish.
So what's the reason behind China buying up America?
Well, because that's the way mercantile countries act. That's what Britain did and all that for years. That was the colonial period and afterwards. Let's get a whole lot of money. This is what was blown away by John Maynard Keynes at Bretton Woods, that this should not be a zero-sum game in which we export a lot and only import a little, so we hold a whole lot of money, and you export a little and import a lot and you have a lot of goods. That's not helping us. Nobody's getting better off for that. World trade should be a balance. It's all sides profit. And if I do all the exporting and build up cash, what have I got? I can't eat cash. The mercantile countries said it makes you strong. You can buy arms and fight wars. Maybe. But basically, if you're not fighting wars, there it sits in the bank. So the thought is that we should now arrange, China should be doing domestic growth to provide wealth for its people, and gradually use some of this surplus or we can buy it back, to diminish our debt to China. Now, on the other hand, I've asked a dozen economists, what happens if the Chinese say we are going to get rid of all these dollars? Well, they said they won't dump them all at once. Nobody can say, here's $1 trillion, who's buying? You can sell them little by little. We would probably undergo some inflation if they did that, but it wouldn't be disastrous. $1 trillion. I mean, George Bush took $1 trillion out of the tax rolls at his first day in office. And we're in trouble, but we're not that bad. So I don't think it's as worrisome as it sounds. Yeah.
Do you think that the human rights situation will change as younger Chinese people are more familiar with freedom through the internet and some personal experience?
Do I think that the Chinese human rights situation will change? I think so, but I think it's going to be very gradual. I do not think China is going to welcome the Dalai Lama and the lamas back to Tibet and turn it back into a theological society. I don't think they're going to allow autonomy or independence for Zhangjiao province out in the east. I think they're going to continue to look very hard at severe critics of the administration, but if Wen Jiabao can say we must become more open, and if the students who demonstrated in Tiananmen Square, who will now be, my goodness, it's 30 years later, 20 years later, 21, they're now in their 40s, have not, I think, given up their thirst for more independence, not total, but for more freedom, able to read more in the newspapers, not to be worried about Google and these other things. I think China can find that this hasn't been as painful as they now feel it might be. I mean, these conservative, careful old men, not old, they're fairly young, but conservative, careful men who rise to the top, don't like to see change. They want harmony, but I think they're beginning to realize that if they want to have better relations with the rest of the world, which will enrich China, they're going to have to be careful about it. They're going to have to move on this issue. And I think Liao Liu Xiaobo would be a very good way to start. I hope they catch on to that. Yeah.
Could you comment on the status of women in China and how that has changed or not changed?
Well, the status of women in China is one of the great revolutions of the 20th century. I mean, people going to China in the 1930s still found women with bound feet. Their feet bound up into little knots so they could barely walk, being deformed from their childhood. Girls being 3 and 4 years old, they tie the foot down, tie the foot down, so it's completely folded up, and they walk on sort of a little nub. Very painful. But that was supposed to be very sexy. There are Chinese poems written in the 19th century that he reached on the table, grabbed her foot. So it was so small. That's changed. That doesn't happen anymore. Chinese women are very liberated. Chinese women now serve in the army. There are platoons, battalions of Chinese women. Chinese women are in the police. Chinese women are all over the place. Chinese women are doing very well in business. I think there's a Chinese billionaire woman. So the Chinese women have been remarkably free to move. Some women, however, in some tribal areas, as in the Muslim areas out in Xinjiang province in the east, and some Tibetan farmer women probably are not as liberated as the women of Beijing and Shanghai. But I think there's been a great deal of progress. I mean, I don't think they are as far along as perhaps we are, or Switzerland. We're not perfect either. But when you think of where they were 100 years ago, it's been a tremendous transformation. Very exciting. Yeah.
I read a book recently by a man called George Friedman. The Next 100 Years, it was called. Not Tom Friedman, George Friedman. And he predicts what's going to happen 100 years from now. He goes through a great big, rationale about everything, and names 3 countries that will be the leading countries of the world, and neither the United States nor China is one of those 3. What do you think of that?
What are the 3?
I didn't say the 3, I'm just saying that neither the United States nor China would be. In his book, the 3 that he says will be are very surprising. Japan, that's not surprising. The other one is Turkey, and the 3rd one is Poland.
I don't know. I'll have to read the book. Those would not have been my 3 choices. I mean,
Very fascinating book.
it sounds fascinating. Yeah. It seems to me that power in the next millennium is going to be based on size, resources, level of economic and technical development. And I think that China and the United States, conceivably Japan, possibly Russia, might be among them. Brazil might be up there. Poland I had not thought of, to be honest. And Turkey, while a fascinating country and certainly a regional power, I think Turkey is currently playing its cards extremely well and will become a regional power, both a European power and Asian power. Its location is a perfect geographic base to be a powerful state, but it hasn't got the resources except water, and water is very powerful in the Middle East. It hasn't got the population, and I'm not sure it's going to have the technological prowess to be a great power in any military or economic or cultural sense. I don't know that. I mean, I remember when we went into Iraq, European countries wouldn't join us. In particular, what Donald Rumsfeld called old Europe, decaying Europe, which is Germany, France, and Belgium. He called them the cheese-eating countries. And he said, we got to go to the real powers, New Europe. Let us move NATO to Latvia and encourage the growth of Bulgaria. Well, okay, Mr. Rumsfeld, if Mr. Friedman thinks that Turkey and Poland are going to rule the world 100 years from now, I wish I'd be here to see it, but I'm not. Yeah.
We hear and read a great deal
about the fact that our students are not keeping up with the students in China, particularly in terms of science and math. Is that something we should be concerned about?
Probably. But our students aren't keeping up with many people in the field of China, science and math. And that's true not just in grade schools and high schools, it's true in universities as well. However, our universities are still the places people want to come to learn about science and math. And in many instances, they're learning about science and math from Chinese or Germans who are immigrants here and have become citizens. And that's the way the United States works. I mean, people come to the United States, find it an extremely attractive cultural atmosphere to live in, and practice their skills. So that the people who are going to build the next whatever it is may well be born in China. But that's okay by me if they're... One thing that the Chinese are very worried about is spying, with some justice. We spy on them. We do. We fly airplanes close to the coast and look at them and listen to whatever they're doing. One of them was hit by a Chinese aircraft, a fighter aircraft who got killed, and sat down, so the Chinese held it so they could take it all apart and put it together again, find out how it all worked. And they're angry about spying. And the agency, CIA, is pretty active in China, I'm sure. There are people here in the United States who are working in sensitive industries who are probably sending home technologies to China. That's very hard to stop. I mean, anybody with access to a computer, he just plugs it in and sends. And the scientific community exchanges information which is probably considered top secret in Washington without any particular, of course you know about this, by the way. So that kind of spying is happening. I'm not sure that's hurting us that much, in all honesty. I think intellectual exchange between skilled physicists at a high level is pretty good for people at both ends of the equation. So yes, we should do more about getting our young people into physics and math and engineering. And I think people are starting to do that. And so are women in particular. More and more women are getting into physics and math and engineering, and that's very exciting. But that'll take some time. And in the meantime, the need in this country for engineers and physicists is probably being met by people from other countries. It turns out that Egyptians are wonderful mathematicians. They're very good at algorithms, so that a lot of people who write computer code for Steve Jobs are Egyptians. The Indians are very good at this stuff. So people come here and work in our industries and share our prosperity, and we become a much more international place. I'm all for immigration reform, but I'm also for getting that kind of person to come and staying with us as long as he or she wishes. Yeah?
A recent Newsweek article states that the young people coming from China today to study here in the United States in math and sciences, getting their educations here, are no longer staying here. We need them here, but they're not staying because of the opportunity they have back home. So we have they're still coming, but they're not raising their families here.
I think some more of them are going home than they did before.
More going home before because there's more opportunity there for them as their economy grows.
And it's becoming a more attractive political atmosphere to live in.
Yes, exactly.
Not much. If they really crack down on human rights, you may find them coming back. Yeah, that's going to happen. Okay. All the more reason to work together. When they go back, they will exchange emails, or however top-notch physicists correspond, with the people with whom they studied here. How are you doing on this problem? Well, I've solved it. Here's my answer. I do not think that physicists necessarily are nationalists. I think they're physicists first and Americans and Chinese after. I hope that's true. But that's not true of other people. Dentists cooperate. I'm an American dentist. I'm not going to tell you how to fix it. Yeah.
No,
sorry.
No, in the human rights area.
I'll come over.
Okay. In the area of human rights, I had understood that people are born classified either as urban or rural. And if you're classified as rural, it's very hard
I don't think that's entirely true. The classification of urban and rural was imposed some time ago, but has been almost totally unenforceable. One Chinese peasant was pretty much like another Chinese peasant, and he comes way out west, comes over and winds up in Shanghai and wants to go to school. They're not going to deport him back to India.
And they're not, and they will admit him to the school.
Well, they can make it through grade school, and then they can make it through junior high, and make it through high school, and then they get to college. Not all Chinese go to college. But certainly the poorer people are demanding education. And it's extremely difficult for any government to say, no, no, you come out there, I want education. Because there will be a riot out there. And people are protesting. They're protesting corruption in the government of which there's nothing. And if they suddenly realize that they've been discriminated against because they came from the wrong part of the country, there's going to be a fuss. And that fuss is going to be there now because they will put it out in email or Google or something. So the Chinese know about it. The Chinese are going to be power. And lose face. And the Chinese government won't lose face. So this is a dynamic of which the Chinese government is obviously aware. And that's what Chen Xiaobiao, the premier prime minister, is talking about. We've got to become more open. And that means that so way out in the West, we've got to be able to get the same education or something pretty close to it that somebody in Shanghai does. So they may not have gotten all the way there, but they're obviously aware of the pressure to act. Yeah.
Could you comment on the relationship between Russia and China?
Well, the relationship between Russia and China has been a little tense. It was certainly very tense during the Cold War, which enabled Richard Nixon to go to China and scare the Russians witless. The Russians, after Nixon went to China, immediately started signing arms controls agreements. All the START 1 and the anti-ballistic missile treaty agreements between ourselves and Russia on the nuclear balance, or imbalance, were the result of the opening to China by Richard Nixon, because they said, wait a minute, we can't count on China, here we are isolated. Russia is a little jealous of this, and what's his name? The president of Russia went to, gosh, my hard disk. Yeah, went to China and has visited a couple of times to try to say, look, we want to work together. They're working together in the Shanghai Cooperative on petroleum, but Russia is being a little tougher on Iran. So I don't think there's any great need felt in China to cooperate very closely with Russia or the other way around. They live on the same continent. If they can get along together and trade modestly amongst each other, that's okay. The only thing that the Russians have to sell is petroleum, and China will surely buy it if they sell it. Also, the oil out in the west, in Kazakhstan and places like that, will probably go through China out to the Pacific Ocean, unless there's a pipeline built in Siberia to get out through Vladivostok. So yes, they will cooperate, but I don't see any building of a great alliance between Russia and China. I think they are too different and don't have enough to offer each other. Certainly not as much as we do with the Chinese. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, it was wonderful. I want to, before you leave, first of all, join me again in thanking Goody Cooke for illuminating, opening a window into China for all of us. I also would like to remind you that our last session of this semester, our last luncheon, is on November 16th, and we are hosting a very distinguished woman from Afghanistan, a real hero. She has been named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most important people in the world because she has dared to create an organization called Voice of Women. She has become an international figure. We're hoping that Senator Casey, who heads the subcommittee on Afghanistan and Pakistan in the subcommittee, in the Foreign Affairs Committee, will be here to greet her and introduce her. He knows her, and that will be an added treat. I would just say, please be sure to come, and you may want to invite a friend to join you that day. Let us know if you do, so that we'll have enough chairs and food. But I look forward to seeing you then, if not before. Thank you.